Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
Creative ideas for effective floor plans. We'll be discussing this and other office design features on this edition of By Design. Developing a floor plan is similar to assembling a jigsaw puzzle. You need all of the pieces and a logical approach to the assembly process. Here to offer advice on the best way to proceed is Mr. Al Chiesa, owner of an architectural firm in Birmingham, Alabama. Al, we've been talking about the various elements that make up a dental office, and I'd like to continue with that discussion and then get into the assembly process to actually arrive at a logical floor plan, if you will. What about the reception room? What design features should go into that?
In a reception room, Joe, you should have easy access from the outside of the building, number one, possibly protected from rain, or many times we like to design a little double door foyer so that you can control a little bit the flow of air into the waiting area.
So the winter storm doesn't come pouring in when you open the outside door.
Yes, and blow you directly into the chairs.
Just bypass the business office.
You want to have adequate seating in quantity. That is, I'd like to have at least twice as many chairs in the waiting area as I have in the treatment areas. You want this to be a very non-threatening area. I find that a lot of dentists like to decorate their waiting areas with dental themes, pictures and the like, and I think this is really not the best way to do it. I would keep it as non-dental as possible.
Are there other aspects of reception room features like practice having a lot of children? Do you address that issue in the design, either in furniture size or items that you'd put in the reception area?
Yes, you don't want to overdo this, Joe, really, but this is done many times, and you could design a theme-oriented waiting area.
Earlier, when you talked about the business area, you suggested an open access to the business area so that the patients, when they come into the reception room, would not have a barrier between them. Is that something that you feel is a significant design feature?
I think it's very important for the patient to feel that when he walks into the office, he is received readily by the team. I like to have an open counter rather than a little window that the patient has to look through to get in contact with the receptionist.
Is this based on more of an interpersonal relationship between the receptionist and the patient, so that they aren't knocking on a little door or something like that that's rather impersonal?
Yes, this would be, let's say, the physical expression of a performance goal, which can be stated in this manner. You want the patient to feel a very close personal contact with the team. So what is then the correct physical expression of that goal? It would be a very open reception.
Very often the placement of restrooms, their design, their position of doorways and that sort of thing is an afterthought. Maybe, as you said earlier in the series, some things just kind of fit in at the end of the design after the major issues are addressed, and I think that restrooms very often fall in that category. What are your thoughts on the placement of restrooms? How many should you have, and some of the features that they should contain?
I think the restrooms should be placed to serve both the front of the office and the rear of the office, or the operatory areas. Very commonly we find that restrooms are assigned in a different manner. We tried to assign a restroom for the dentist, a restroom for the patients, and a restroom for the staff, maybe. I don't really believe that this is necessary, but on an office that is large, probably you would need one close to the waiting area where patients could have access to it without walking through the office, and similarly one that is easily accessible from the treatment areas.
Essentially, you're saying you don't want patients to penetrate the functional area to go to the restroom by placing it close to the reception room.
That is true.
What about the private office for the dentist? Are there guidelines that are useful there?
Yes, I think it should be a very small, compact area, something in the order of 8 feet square maybe, or 8 by 10 is perfectly sufficient. It should be, I see it as something that it should be in the rear of the office, something that patients have no access to. I think the dentist needs an escape valve, if I may call it so.
Just to get away by himself
And
or
there's a lot of business items that need to be taken care in privacy.
Dark rooms. What are your thoughts on dark rooms?
I think dark rooms are slowly vanishing from the dental office. We see more and more people going to processors just located in the support areas. If you do elect to have a dark room, a very, very small little room would suffice very nicely, something in the order of 3 feet square.
Do you think that dentists still cling to the need for dark rooms based on the fear that their processor may fail and they'll have a backup hand capability, manual method of processing films?
Probably so, Joe. That's my best interpretation of it.
You mentioned the utility area for vacuum pump, air compressor, heavy equipment, perhaps a water recirculator, those kinds of items, tanks for nitrous oxide and oxygen. What are your thoughts on that room in terms of placement?
I like to place the tanks in such a manner that they can be accessible from both the inside and the outside of the office. The suction pump and compressor should be located so that they could be serviced easily. We usually make the mistake of allocating very little space for these items, and when time comes to service them, it's a major headache.
Are people tending to go to stacking in these utility rooms, placing the air compressor on a rack on the bottom, a vacuum pump above that, or vice versa, to save space, a stacking so that they can gain access? Have you experienced that?
Yes, I see nothing wrong with that.
Outside of the basic framework of an office, you know, the fundamental elements, of course, the sky's the limit. Given the ability to pay for space, the dentist can add as many optional areas. Perhaps what I might consider as an optional area, some other dentist might think that that's a mandatory basic area. What about some of the optional areas, such as consultation rooms?
Well, I think a consultation room is a very valuable addition to the office because handling of new patient, it's something that needs to be done in a very specialized kind of area. I don't believe that you should do consultation by the chair.
How about in the private office of the dentist?
Yes, this places a burden on the doctor to keep his office clean and uncluttered, and that this very seldom happens.
How about areas such as a prevention room?
This could double up as a consultation room.
So we do see them pushed together. Are there some features that should be incorporated in these rooms to make them more convenient to use?
I think what you want is a very small room, maybe 50 to 70 square feet, with room for a table and 2 or 3 chairs. That is perfectly sufficient.
What about mirrors and sinks, that sort of thing, if you go into a prevention use for that room?
That sounds like a very good idea.
I'm wondering, in terms of such things as Panorex or panoramic radiography, do you visualize that as a separate room or a cubbyhole type of facility?
Yes, I think you want to locate this in a separate area so that if you have a patient being taken care of in that area, you do not preclude the use of any other of the rooms.
Very often we see staff lounges incorporated into a practice where the staff can go on breaks, perhaps stay in the office over the lunch hour, have some locker space or closet space, a place to change clothes if they need to. Is that something that you feel is helpful?
Yes, I think so, Joe. In many cases, you know, the small little things that have been forgotten in the design process become major irritants later on. The lack of a place to hang your coat may not seem like much when you're concerned with what is the correct size of the operatories and things of this nature in the design process. But later on, as the years go by, this can become a major headache, really, and staff dissatisfaction and so forth. And there's many examples of that nature. And this, again, brings to the fore the need to have in writing a very detailed account of all the things that the office should have, whether it's a checklist or a set of goals.
That goes back to your earlier comments when we started discussing office design, that make notes about where you want to go,
Right.
and perhaps this idea of having these optional areas move out of the optional category and into the mandatory
Yes.
functional area.
If I may add something, depending on what stage of the practice this dentist is, he or she may want to consider the addition of one other item that is not necessarily of a functional nature, but of possibly importance in terms of the aesthetics of the whole thing, like an atrium, a planting area, an outside garden, or something of this nature that really adds a lot to the whole environment.
We've talked about elements now. Let's put the pieces together and get your thoughts on how you proceed in the assembly process. What's the first step?
Well, I think the first step is to define basic areas, or let me call them zones inside the office. If you are building a new building, you may want to define zones in the land that is to be used. You may want to analyze different options as to where or what side of the property the building should go in, or the parking lot should go in, or additional rental area may go in. Once you have decided that, or if you're leasing a space already built, you may want to, first of all, think in terms of, let's say, the basic 3 zones of an office: the front, the operatory areas, and last, the support areas. And in that manner, you proceed from the more general concepts down to the particulars.
Do you, in working with a dentist, ask the dentist to provide a rough sketch of these zones to deliver to you, at which time you develop into a further refined drawing, or do you actually do this zone drawing and in fact present it to the dentist? What is the order there?
We usually do that work.
Once you have the general layout of the office, I want this element here, and so forth and so on, at what point in time does traffic flow become a critical issue? Do you now say, well, I've got these elements, now let's look and see how the traffic flows through here, and what are you trying to achieve with traffic flow?
Well, this will start showing immediately after you have defined your basic zones. The next step would be to actually create some partitions and rooms and doors so that this embryo, that is the zones, becomes now a more well-defined layout, let's say.
Specifically, what are your thoughts on traffic patterns? What should you be trying to achieve within that design, that floor plan?
Well, let me talk about two things. Number one, let's try to avoid bottlenecks. And number two, let's talk about separation of circulations. Avoiding bottlenecks is something that sounds perfectly obvious and yet is left out or unattended to in most cases. Major bottlenecks develop usually at the appointment counter in an office, because there's a lot of activity going on there, and there's consequently usually several people stationed at that point. And yet we see appointment counters located close to where the operative areas are. This is a major problem.
Are you suggesting that there's congestion within the business office area, or the people passing by that reception desk?
I'm suggesting that I would like to see a design such that these congested areas are allowed sufficient space in which to develop, and also to locate them away from the circulation of the staff, the team. Mm-hmm. And this brings me directly into the concept of separate circulations. When we talked about arrangement of the operatories, we said that there could conceivably be access to the operatories from the front and the back. And this is a very convenient way to arrange this, because it actually puts the circulation of the patients in an entirely different area from the circulation of the team members.
The idea of a patient corridor separate from a staff corridor.
That is correct.
So that the staff can move instruments and supplies to support areas without bumping into patients that are trying to get in.
That's right. I think it's very hard to overstate the importance of this.
What about distances of travel for staff members? You're talking about conflict of people congesting, maybe perhaps even literally bumping into each other, trying to move around each other. But the distance from one point to another, between operatories, or from the reception room to an operatory, or from the sterilization area to treatment areas. What are your thoughts there? Are you trying to shorten those areas, or to consolidate the distances? Or
there's no way that you can optimize the circulation of everybody concerned. So something has to give. I'd like to think that the most valuable participant in this team is the dentist. So he or she will have to be using the least possible travel. Second in importance is the other members of the staff. So I'd like to arrange sterilization areas and supply storage areas in such a manner that they're easily accessible from the treatment rooms. I think we mentioned before that the patient is there a very short period of time, and need not be really taken into account as far as length of travel is concerned. It doesn't affect them really one way or the other.
they walk 20 feet or 10 feet.
It doesn't really make any difference.
We have seen changes in general floor plans, I think, over the last 20 years. In the early years of dental practice, we saw dentists practicing in individual boxes, treatment rooms within confines of their office. Now we're seeing compromises in that, maybe having some walls missing from those individual rooms, or in some cases absolutely an open design with no walls separating one patient from another. What are your thoughts on those concepts?
Well, I think we go more and more to the open office, Joe. And let me say that I have never seen yet one that, after being in use for a certain amount of time, presented any problem. People are reluctant sometimes to open up their offices, and yet really it's a good way to go. But let me say this. There's two ways that you can design an office. You can imagine a set of cubicles or rooms into which different pieces of equipment will be placed or different functions performed. This gives birth to your traditional office plan. Another way to do it, which I think is more appropriate, is to imagine no walls, but pieces of equipment or functions being performed in a totally open, barrier-free or screen-free environment. This allows you total freedom to place the different areas, the different pieces of equipment and so forth in the most efficient manner. Now, after you have done that, you have an opportunity to analyze where and why you do need walls between some of these areas. And it's a lot easier to justify the fact that there's a lot of walls that you would think were necessary that are really not.
You have several floor plans with you. I'm wondering if you could show us a few of these plans and offer us the critique of those plans, either the rationale why you did something one way or another, or why it's there. Maybe you're not entirely happy with the design, if you would.
For instance, Joe, this particular plan here, layout in the sense that it's a single circulation scheme with a hallway with different treatment areas and different functions arranged along that central hallway. What happens is that you have the three basic zones that we talked about before. You have the front where the access is, the waiting area, the business office. Then you have the center area of the office with the dentist private office and the optories. And then you have the lab and storage of supplies and utility rooms in the back.
But essentially fairly conventional design with barriers between operatories.
It is open to a certain extent, but this is what you would call a very conventional layout, in that there are, nevertheless, very clearly defined rooms. As opposed to that, Joe, this other plan is better zoned and has better traffic flow, I believe. As you see, the front of the office is totally devoted to reception and business offices. You see the incorporation of a multi-purpose room in the front, which can take care of a number of tasks that need to be conducted in privacy.
Like discussing accounts.
Discussing accounts, arranging payment plans and collection calls and the like.
That's a nice idea.
The central zone of the office is then totally separate from that, and this is good in many respects. The concept of sound privacy here comes into mind. I think you want a certain amount of sound insulation between the treatment areas and the reception. We talked about having the reception done in a non-dental theme, but of course that wouldn't help us much if you can hear the drills clearly from the reception area. So you want to insulate those two areas as much as possible. And then the last zone, or rear, is where the doctor's private study and lab and utility areas are. The separate circulations are illustrated here in that patients have access to the optories from the foot of the chair, and the staff has access to the optories from the head of the chair.
I notice also that you do have two restroom areas, one serving the patient area toward the front of the building, and then another back by the doctor's study.
Yes, I think different practices will have different requirements. There's some type of practices where patients are heavily sedated or maybe intravenously sedated, where immediate access from the optories to a bathroom is required.
Earlier in our discussion, you mentioned there should be 4 feet of distance from the head of the chair to the nearest obstruction behind the chair. And I noticed that you have quite a distance in this particular design. Does that satisfy your needs?
I think it does, yes, Joe. I think it satisfies the need for traffic of the staff from optory to optory, and also it allows for the placement of a second assistant on the other side of the mobile cabinet, and this is very important.
Do the hose connections for the nitrous oxide get in the way at all in terms of the mobile cabinet being pushed forward and bumping into them?
No, they're located on this side of the mobile cabinet here, and they should not get in the way. There are many different schemes, really, Joe. This in particular is sort of a halfway approach between the conventional office, in which you can sometimes accomplish a very compact layout, and the more elaborate, usually more space-consuming but more efficient separate circulation scheme. In this particular case, the idea is that we need to achieve a very compact office. This is in the order of about 1,400 square feet, and yet we see that we have incorporated 4 treatment areas and all the other components that we have discussed in the past. It is a hybrid design in that even though there is a staff circulation and a patient circulation, the staff needs to use the patient circulation for certain functions.
But it's lessened considerably by separating.
That is correct. Most of the traffic for the staff is conducted in this back area here, and that in itself reduces the traffic congestions in the other hallway, and that helps a lot.
I think it's interesting that you've added the mini lab on the back without having to increase the size of the whole length of the structure. Just by coming out with a semicircular addition to the main structure, you were able to place the mini lab in the position that you wanted, as opposed to enlarging the entire facility.
Yes, this is a very asymmetrical layout, and I think that in itself makes it very flexible so that you can add here and there without having to increase the size of the whole building, as you said.
You had one plan that showed the operatories adjacent to the reception areas, so that there was a direct doorway between the reception areas. How has that worked?
I think it works very well. We have soundproofed that wall and doors between the 2 rooms. Of course, the connection is not open, or the door is not open, but when the patient is not in the chair. So we have not found a privacy problem in this, although we have developed other plans with the same concept where a different type of barrier exists.
As we've been talking over this 3-part series, I've been hearing a lot of things. I've been hearing design ideas, decorative ideas. I've been hearing construction factors, things that we'd have to work with a contractor. I certainly, from the financial part of it, could envision involvement of the financial people, bankers, accountants, and so forth. It seems to me that what we're really talking about in a project of this magnitude is a team approach to doing something like this.
Yeah, the problem is of great magnitude, if not necessarily always in size, but in complexity. So you have described perfectly the right approach. I think it should be a team approach where the owner is the leader of the team, or the dentist in this case.
Who do you perceive as being team members?
Team members should be, number 1, the dentist. Number 2, any key member of the dental team. Number 3, a number of consultants to the owner, starting with management consultants, financial consultants, architect, interior design, lawyer or attorneys, builder.
All working closely together to make it happen.
They all should come into play at one time or another. It is hopefully for the owner, in this case the dentist, to manage the performance of the team in such a manner that he brings into play these different people at the right times. What happens is that many times the architect takes the leading role because he falls very nicely into this role.
Al, thank you very much for doing this series for us. It's been very, very helpful. Mr. Al Chiesa, an architect who specializes in the design of efficient dental offices throughout the United States. Join us for other programs in this series that are designed to keep you abreast of current topics and trends in the management of a modern dental practice.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.